Hey everyone, it's Samuel.
And I'm Mike.
And welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons & Dragons.
Today, in the Prime Material, role-playing a hermit in your adventuring party.
In the wilds, the Naga.
And in the tavern, what would you do if the statues around you came to life when you weren't looking?
Let's go. So how's it going, Mike?
It's going great.
Good. Well, for those of you wondering, Matt's out this week, so we have one of our other peeps, Mike, in here to do the episode today, and we're going to be talking about a couple of your characters today.
It's going to be fun.
Before we get into that, just a couple of quick announcements. Remember to follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and support us on Patreon if you don't mind. Helps our show run a little bit smoother and continue to upgrade our technology and work everything out for you guys and make everything good for y'all. And remember, when we get to 250 followers on Twitter, we're giving away to a random follower a D&D sourcebook of their choice, whether you want to start your collection with the Player's Handbook or the Monster Manual, or if you're interested in the pre-ordering the latest book, the Critical Role book set in Wildmount, The Adventurer's Guide to Wildmount. Any that you choose, we will be happy to give a lucky follower one of those whenever we hit 250. With that out of the way, the Hermit. The Hermit is a common character trope in narratives, both as a reclusive individual who the protagonist of a story has to interact with, and also where the protagonist of the narrative themselves are a secluded individual. Someone who has to come out of their hermitage and back into society. And we can see examples of that all over popular culture, from Radagast the Brown in The Hobbit, Ben Kenobi in the first Star Wars A New Hope, Beast in Beauty and the Beast, Erick, also known as the titular character in the Phantom of the Opera. And this is a pretty common trope in role-playing games as well. As DMs, having our player characters come across a hermit provides an excellent opportunity for a great role-playing encounter and an interesting narrative. As PCs, we enjoy rolling a reclusive character who, for one reason or another, has left his hermit lifestyle and joined an adventuring party. And it's the concept of role-playing a hermit as a PC that we wanted to discuss today. And you've actually got some experience with that.
I do. I've rolled up 2 different characters with varying degrees of a hermit aspect to their personalities.
Yeah, in fact, it's a common enough thing that people do that hermit's even a background, one of the basic backgrounds in the Player's Handbook. It's a popular character choice. But at the same time, it's a choice that adds some unique challenges to our role-playing, doesn't it? It adds some difficulties to our narratives because your character, and in your case, the 2 characters we'll be discussing today, Twilight and Vorgak, those characters have to make the decision to leave their seclusion and rejoin society. And that decision comes with implications and hardships that can be challenging to build a narrative around. You have to figure out exactly how this thing is going to work in order to build a cohesive narrative. So today we just wanted to have a discussion about some of those potential challenges and ways that you could potentially deal with them. Again, as always, Mike and I are not presenting firm rules here, but just having a discussion in order to prompt your own ideas and thoughts as you might be considering playing a hermit-style character. So I guess to start off with, just introduce us to your 2 characters. Tell us a little bit about Vorgak.
So Vorgak was built around the idea of a mountain orc, and because the world we built had been primarily peaceful, they were not nearly as warlike as most of orcs tend to be in your in general with D&D.
Yes, in the homebrew setting that this particular campaign was set in, orcs were much more like the orcs in Skyrim. They're not just your typical violent, always an enemy orcs. They are much more so like what you would think half orcs are typically in your D&D games. They're just more brutish, but still members of society.
Exactly. And I built Vorgak around the idea of, he made a decision. He wanted to be a warrior. He had all these histories and tales from back when his people were strong warriors. And he came up with the idea to harry the elder of his village to teach him to be a great warrior. And tired of this whippersnapper telling him to do stuff, they sent him on a quest up the mountain to do something. And once he got there, he realized that he had been sent on a useless errand, and out of shame, this character decided to stay behind in these mountains. And a short stay in the mountains quickly turned into a decade. And I built the character around, like, wanting to be a warrior and then becoming a peaceful character in these mountains in his life. Yeah,
absolutely. Pretty much the only violence that he would ever do, if you even call it violence, is just simple hunting for food. You know,
self-protection, depending on the situation.
That's true. Yep. And you also, in a campaign which is currently going on, you rolled up the character of Twilight, who's a shifter. Tell us a little bit about Twilight.
So Twilight, I built around the idea of, I used a homebrew that I found online called the Feral Child. And it's the idea of a child abandoned somewhere and then raised by creatures. Most shifters are based off of the concept of a beast aspect, and they are actually descendant from lycanthropes, which I found out recently.
Yeah, I believe they're an Eberron-specific setting race, which we incorporated into this homebrew setting that we run.
And in your current setting, we don't know if there are other shifters. They've been rumored and heard about, but we haven't actually seen them. But the idea I had was that this character was raised by giant hares, and Twilight themselves is actually less reclusive than Vorgak, and he does have interaction with other people, but he actually has a disability of speech. He doesn't speak common, which made it very difficult for him to connect with people outside of where he was being raised. And so his hermit nature is more enforced upon him by his circumstances of his background, rather than a choice that he made to go into being secluded. And I think big difference between these two characters is the mindset of Vorgak wanting to be disconnected from society versus Twilight, who desperately wants to connect with people and be connected and involved, and unable to communicate, and the frustrations that come with someone who can't communicate or struggles to communicate.
And so you built both of these characters, and once a character, whether it's the ones that you built or any sort of hermit type character that we've rolled, we have to then start facing the challenges of getting them into an adventuring party and figuring out how they're going to interact. So the first challenge is just, why are they leaving their seclusion? A hermit that you've rolled up can't just automatically show up in the middle of an adventuring party without any reason.
It doesn't make sense. I mean, you've literally chosen to exclude yourself from life by the character design. So suddenly showing up in an adventure party and then saying, I hate people, or whatever your reasoning is going to make it really difficult for the rest of the party.
You have to consider, how they're going to actually become a part of this adventuring party. You can't just assume that they meet in a tavern, the classic trope, because depending on your hermit, you may never have ever ended up in a tavern.
What's a tavern? How does this work? I don't know how this works.
I've never been to a town before. Depending on your situation, it can be really difficult to actually figure that out. But it's an important challenge to confront. And one of the key things to think about, I think, whenever you're confronting this challenge in our role playing and in our storytelling, is to pick out why they became a hermit in the first place. And if you can determine why you became a hermit in the first place, then that can really inform what circumstances would cause you to leave. You know, with Vorgak, you had a character who voluntarily went up into the mountains and decided to stay there and live, and actually began to commune with the elemental of the mountain, and actually became what we ended up building out is a homebrew class based around Avatar: The Last Airbender's Earthbenders.
Exactly.
And he actually began to commune with this particular entity. And knowing why he became a hermit in the first place, knowing why he went into that position, allowed you to come up with a circumstance which would cause them to leave.
Exactly.
Which would cause Vorgak to leave and re-enter society.
When we built the Earthbender concept, I actually drew pretty heavily from a book series that I really enjoy called The Iron Druid, where the character, communing with elementals, has a connection to the earth that he couldn't, either the elementals tell him or he can sense that things are wrong. And the big thing we built into Vorgak was that he wanted peace. That change of communing with the elemental brought about this desire for peace where he had once been desiring combat and war. And building on that, the way we drew him into the environment for the adventure was this overwhelming sense of something is wrong and I have to fix it.
Yeah.
And building that into that character gave you the ability to give me a role-playable reason of why I ended up all the way halfway across the continent.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure, because based on where we say I originated to where I am, is thousands of miles away. And, you know, and...
Yeah, and that was great because, again, the circumstances why you became a hermit, where you went up and you began to seek peace and you began to isolate yourself and then you began to commune with this elemental, that gave us a clear narrative direction into why you would leave. The reason you would leave is that elemental communicated to you that there was a problem in the world, that there was something wrong with the earth, and that had, you know, a whole connection with the overarching storyline of that campaign, which we were able to pull in. That's the first challenge we really have to consider whenever we're playing a hermit character is why they would leave their seclusion. And that's going to differ based on what your character is. I think that exercise of trying to put yourself in their shoes and figure out why this character became a hermit in the first place and what's keeping them in their seclusion, thinking about that can really inform why they would actually leave and figure out the circumstances which would get them into that place.
Totally agree.
The second challenge is you have to decide, how are they going to act in society? You have to figure out, they were a hermit for a certain amount of time, depending on your particular circumstance. They may have been a hermit their entire life, as it was with Twilight, or they may have been a hermit like Vorgak, where they were only a hermit for a certain amount of time, and that could be, you know, have occurred in any point in their life, so they could have entered their hermitage, entered their seclusion early in their life or later in their life after they've had a lot of socialization. Depending on your situation, you've got to look at those circumstances and figure out, okay, now that this hermit is in society, how are they going to act? Because again, if we're trying to discuss how to role play a hermit in an authentic way, you can't expect somebody who's been out of society to come back into society and behave completely like they never left.
Exactly. And I feel like you played this up really well with Vorgak, setting the stage where you put Vorgak in a city at New Year's Eve in a tavern that was literally the last place that he could stay, because it was the only place that had anywhere where he could stay. And it gave me the opportunity to literally have that situation of where is your character right now? Which I believe was the question you asked me.
Yeah.
And I said, I'm as far underneath the nearest staircase as I can get with my back to everyone, facing the wall, trying to zone out these people that are talking and celebrating and enjoying.
Yeah. And because of your particular circumstances, you had some awkward social encounters like that. You were more comfortable sleeping outside rather than in the tavern with the group.
Else. Yeah.
With Twilight, there's some social anxiety that is there because of a mere lack of socialization. And you have to discover the authentic way to roleplay that so that you can actually authentically make sure that they feel like they were a hermit in your story. But at the same time, you have to make sure that this isn't oppressive to the rest of the party.
Very true.
Because one thing that we can fall into is having a character that is socially awkward, not because of just being a klutz or just being a bumbling comic relief character, but a character that actually has some sort of social anxiety or some other reason like that. It can become oppressive to all the party's social encounters, and it can quickly begin to override the rest of the party's narratives, because every time the party is trying to role play specific social encounters, everything becomes about this socially awkward character.
Exactly.
And it can become a real burden on the party, and it can actually decrease immersion, and it can make the different players around the table frustrated because of the way that the interaction goes. But at the same time, you have this balance of you have to figure out a way to make it feel authentic, because this character is a hermit, but you have to make it not oppressive to the rest of the party.
Correct. And I feel like you have to work with your DM as well as with the rest of the party. And outside of gameplay, discuss things, work with things. I know we did a big thing with Twilight, as I previously mentioned, that Twilight doesn't speak Common. And only speaks a little bit of Elven, which initially building up to this session, I had intentionally planned to roleplay that as a very quiet character that doesn't interact. The build for Twilight is a shifter aberrant mind sorcerer based out of Unearthed Arcana. And one of those abilities that come with the aberrant mind is the ability to speak telepathically with anyone within a 30 range. The direct interpretation in the book, as it's written, is that you have to choose who you're talking to, and they're the only ones that can hear you. You made a very good twist on that in our first session, where Twilight, who has been secluded from people and not been in a large group, his power grew in that moment, connecting with the group, which allowed him to speak to everyone at once if he willed it. And that gave me, playing the hermit character who had always wanted to talk to people, now the ability to talk to everybody and communicate, and it gave me more options. And if you're DMing or playing, those kind of options give you those openings to increase the playability of the character. And you're not just sitting there waiting for your chance to talk because you're 35 feet away from somebody and you can't communicate with them anymore.
And you also have to look at giving room for the character to grow too.
Exactly.
As you're working with your DM about it. Every roleplay encounter that your character gets to interact with, every social encounter that your character gets to go through, you're growing. You're becoming less and less of a hermit in a way with every interaction. You're getting that socialization that you lacked, or either from birth or by choice later in life. And that creates a good opportunity for storytelling as your character grows as well, because you're becoming more and more accustomed to the particular interactions with your party. If you just say, okay, this is a character that is stuck with being a hermit, he's always going to be socially awkward, awkward. He's always going to really wear down on each social encounter of the party. That's going to get old. And it also isn't going to be authentic either, because you made that decision, which may very well be true for the beginning of the character.
Exactly.
But as the character progresses, there's no progression.
Right.
There's no growth with your character, and that is another thing that can kind of bear on your party and just generate a little bit of frustration, I think.
I agree, and I feel like there's no reward there. If your character doesn't progress socially, it isn't challenging and it's not interesting to the rest of the party. And I feel like a big aspect is the idea of reading the room as both a DM and as a player. Because when that situation of changing the mental commands came about, we technically hadn't discussed it beforehand. However, I read the room as you were tweaking it as I was speaking and realized the pacing for the adventure that you had planned. You didn't want to spend weeks and months of us in game time with my character learning to talk to more people. It gave the opportunity for our adventure to continue because we only have a limited amount of time.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big aspect. Knowing the room, knowing your character, and knowing your table.
Absolutely. And that's an important part of role-playing games in general, is you do have that social contract that you've agreed to implicitly by joining a particular campaign with your other party members. That social contract of you actually coming together and interacting and trying to collaboratively tell a story. And if you don't read the room, if you become oppressive, and that this is not just true for the hermit, but if you have any aspect of your character which can become oppressive in their interactions, then it can really detract from that collaborative storytelling effort, because you take the spotlight from other characters, and situations which shouldn't necessarily be about your particular character become about your particular character. But again, it's still a challenge that you have to think about, is how they are going to interact in society. So we have the first two challenges. Why are they leaving their seclusion? And how are they going to act in society? The third and final challenge we were going to look at is, how do they approach combat? What kind of beings have they faced in their seclusion? Is combat completely new to them? Are they really willing to charge in because maybe they've learned to defend themselves in an isolated manner? Or are they scared of combat? Do they fight from a distance? Have they really not encountered normal creatures that a party might come across? But yeah, how are they going to approach combat? For you, how did that go about with Twilight and Vorgak?
So as Vorgak, our first encounter was very short.
Yes.
One round, I had chose to wait before doing anything, and it was actually the Imprisoned Lich, which I believe you've mentioned previously on this.
Yeah.
And the Lich was so weak that we defeated him in one round without my character actually having to do anything. So I didn't really get a chance to make a decision. The next time we had an encounter with the Law Mages that we were combating, I chose to grapple. I chose to stop combat. I chose to intimidate. I made intimidation rolls. I feel like a lot of times we, in combat, forget that you have other roles. You can intimidate. You can choose to talk. You can choose to try to diffuse the situation in other ways. And I chose that for my character because he was taking a very passive role, because while he knew there was things going wrong and things were happening, he didn't have the information to make a lethal decision.
Yeah. Yeah, he was in your particular situation where your hermit was, in Vorgak's case, was a pacifist. You didn't want to use that lethal force, and
if
so
I didn't feel like it was necessary.
Exactly. So you know, with your grapples, with your imprisons, your character's very large, and as a mountain orc in that campaign, and you literally made a roll and were able to just lift a guy off of the floor.
I remember
with it by his neck, and yelled at him, telling him to stop it.
Yeah.
And it's you were able to approach that particular combat in that way, and you, throughout the rest of the campaign, you didn't ever break the social contract where if you're in combat, you can't just role play a character where, oh, I'm not going to fight. Because this is Dungeons and Dragons.
It is.
You're going to end up in combat encounters, and you can't break the social contract by trying to play a character that literally will never do anything in a fight.
Correct.
But you had to think about how you, as a predominantly pacifist character, as this character, and how this hermit approached combat. You had to think about he only used combat as a last resort.
Exactly.
And so he didn't ever initiate initiative.
Yes.
You know, he never just brutally did anything. But whenever his party was under threat, whenever he was under threat, he defended those that he cared about.
Correct.
He tried to stop combat where he could, but he actually was very intentional about how he did his combat. He didn't just start flinging rocks around as his earthbender self. He was very intentional with how he did it. And we have to think about that as with our hermit characters.
I also built it around that idea of locking people down, like you said. Most of my abilities were about grabbing people, stopping the earth.
Yeah.
And I will say the character changed over time.
Yeah,
as I was exposed to combat, as you know, we realized that the creatures we were fighting are pure evil. There was no recompense for them. And there was, I feel like, a defining moment, which is important for characters, where we came across a very villainous character that had attacked basically defenseless characters. Yeah. And the pacifism of my character broke.
Yes.
And I remember dispatching the character swiftly and in a way that disturbed our paladin character and he disapproved of but did not act on. Yes. And it's stuff like that your character has to grow and change through combat.
Yeah, and with Twilight, we're only one session at the point of this recording into this campaign. With Twilight, your character being raised by hares, you know, as this feral child almost, this hermit by circumstance and not by choice. You're an extremely fast character.
I am.
You're a shifter with a hare-based transformation, and you're able to run across the battlefield really fast. And you had to think about in the lone combat encounter that we've had so far exactly how you're going to approach that particular combat.
I did. So with Twilight, I spent a lot more time thinking about the mentality of what Twilight was going through. With Vorgak, I kind of just jumped right in and I clung to that pacifism. With Twilight, coming into that first encounter, I actually took a character flaw of impulsiveness. And so when that combat opened, the first thing my character did was charge the enemy. Yeah. Which, as a squishy sorcerer, is not a good idea. And my mentality was the fact that I'm fast, I'll be able to get out of the combat quickly, and as the character, Twilight wanted to make an impression. He was surrounded by these obviously powerful beings. Introduction into the world for our characters for that session was a long display of powerful beings doing powerful magics and abilities. Yeah. And having sat and watched that for those hours that you described as each person went through it of these background characters, I felt like Twilight had gathered this bravado of this is battle and I'm going to show my skills. And quickly learned that was a terrible idea. And I think that played into Twilight's character growth because he hasn't used magic on a combative stance. It's mostly been out of curiosity and learning how to do this stuff by setting trees on fire and calling down lightning bolts and oh cool, look what I can do. Yeah. But never actually having to put his life on the line. And not having the experience. Yeah, and again, just as a hermit, you had never been in a combat encounter like that before, and so you are having to think about, as the person role playing it, how exactly they're going to react in that character. And that's just one of the challenges that we face as we're role playing secluded characters. So I hope that just helps everyone out there. Provides some prompts and some thinking.
with regards to role-playing your secluded characters. It definitely is a challenging thing, but it's very rewarding whenever it's done in an authentic manner, and it can really be a character that provides a great storytelling opportunity for growth, because they're being forced in situations where they have to grow a lot more. But yeah, I think now we're ready to head out into the wilds. What you think?
Let's head on out.
Mike.
Indeed.
Today, we're looking at the Naga, which is found in the Monster Manual on page 233. So what is a Naga?
So a Naga is a very large, intelligent, and immortal snake. But they're not human-snake hybrids like some mythologies. It's just a very large serpentine entity.
Yep.
They were created a long time ago by an unknown civilization to be guardians of the artifacts and magics that the culture had. However, eventually, that civilization died out.
Yeah.
And after that, the Nagas remained as those guardians.
Yeah. Yeah, they continue to protect and to cherish the vestiges that they were created to guard. Interestingly, these serpents have a very, very high view of themselves. And upon the disappearance of their creators, they viewed themselves as the logical heirs of these items and this knowledge. And they'll even seek new knowledge to add to their collection and to enhance their own innate and magical abilities. And so Nagas, after the passing of this civilization so many years ago, they began to create dominions for themselves. And they believed that in their dominions, they were the apex of all living beings amidst their prime material realms.
They're so proud of
themselves. Yes, they are. It's almost... It's not quite dragon-esque, but there is a dragon
It's more of a hoard
aspect.
of knowledge.
Yeah. Well, yes, yeah. That's true. But speaking more in terms of their view of themselves, you know, dragons, especially the chromatics, have this very haughty and high view of themselves as the apex of evolution.
Yeah.
And they have that view of themselves almost. And they rule with an iron fist over that territory. And some aren't evil. Some govern absolutely with the evil ruling of fear. But some do it with a kind hand, still giving no allowance for dissent, but with a more kind hand, if you can have a kind iron-fisted hand. There are 3 types in the Monster Manual that are given, 3 different stat blocks. But interestingly, the 3 types are vastly different in how they act. And so the Naga provides lots of different avenues for how you can use them in your storytelling efforts.
The good one, as you mentioned, with the kind touch is the Guardian Naga. Challenge rating 10, and their goal is to hoard secrets and artifacts for protection. And they keep the powerful knowledge that they have obtained and that they've gathered and continue to gather away from evil hands.
Yeah, absolutely. The Spirit Naga is a little bit weaker at a challenge rating of 8, and it is the evil Naga. It's very vindictive, and it likes to use its immense power to oppress others and to take revenge on those that it feels harmed by. It is very much a dictator of a ruler and a very much an evil entity.
Finally, there's the Bone Naga, which is a Naga that was taken by the Jon team. A monster for another day, not today, and was subjected to powerful necromancy, which has turned the Guardian Naga or Spirit Naga into a minion.
Yeah.
This process robs the Nagas of its immortality as it literally turns into an undead skeleton. And it's the weakest at about challenge rating 4.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, these are just so interesting with their different aspects of how you could use them in a story. For one, they are immortal. You know,
Yes.
The guardian Nagas and the spirit Nagas by nature come to life in 1d6 days with nothing that's able to stop it except for a wish spell. And they make great repeating villains in your story that way, because you can have a party that kills a Naga, and then it comes back without them understanding why, and they have to figure out a way to imprison it or to seal it, and it can create a very interesting repeating villain in your storytelling.
Especially since, as you said, they have domains, they have people that they lead and control, and you have that interesting storytelling of this character that comes back to life and sends its minions after you. And why do these minions keep showing up? I thought we defeated the villain.
Absolutely. Spirit Nagas, the evil Nagas, are excellent bosses for campaign arcs in lower to mid levels. Since they rule over an area, the arc could be focused on ridding the area of their oppressive rule, or something along those lines. And they're not too powerful to prohibit, lower level parties being able to go through a campaign arc like this, because you can move a party from level 3 to level 6 or so as they're going through building up to actually encountering this Spirit Naga, and then have the Spirit Naga as a great boss in that particular arc like that.
Well, and in that same thread, you almost also have the Guardian Nagas as an opposite, as a help.
Yeah.
And they can give you resources to stop an evil entity from obtaining stuff, because that works toward the Naga's goals of protecting things from evil hands.
Yeah.
You also have this interesting connection of good versus evil, of two Nagas vying for control that you could have at opposite ends of a story.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be really interesting.
Yeah, to run a campaign with those characters building up to this final battle between the two Nagas that you have to help.
Yeah.
And
I like that idea that you mentioned of the Guardian Nagas being almost like a patron. You have this powerful, good entity that is ruling over and protecting magical secrets, has things that your party is going to want, and you can use it almost like Paarthurnax in Skyrim.
Very true.
And where he's a character that your party can go to and seek knowledge from, and that is just this powerful force. That's a real interesting character that you can add into your story. And they don't have to be a big part of your narrative either. They also just make excellent single encounters. If your party is in an ancient ruin or an ancient temple, somewhere where there's lots of ancient magical knowledge, that's an area where a Naga might be living naturally, or an area where a Naga might be encountered as it's out seeking more knowledge. So you can have a party come across them in that way, and that could be a real interesting, just singular encounter.
You could even have a bone Naga in a tavern or something that's been abandoned.
Yeah.
That's just been left to its own devices, because while undead, it doesn't die.
Yeah.
And like you said, a singular encounter. They won't come back if defeated.
And you can use bone Nagas as well if you're coming across Yuan-ti, since they are created by Yuan-ti, and that can provide a little bit of variety of encounters, because if you are in a campaign where you're spending a few sessions trying to root out Yuan-ti, it can be a little repetitive facing the same villains over and over again. Having a few bone Nagas thrown in there as their undead minions, as their servants, can add a little bit of variety. You could even have the party in your stories come across a war between the Yuan-ti and the Nagas. You could have bone Nagas and Yuan-ti on one side, and a few of the other Nagas on the other side, and their minions fighting each other. They hate each other. Yeah. Both of those entities believe, the Monster Manual states it as they're the peak of serpentine evolution. And so they have this natural conflict with each other. So there's just lots of ways that you can use the Naga in your story. And a very versatile and interesting creature. All right, well, you ready to head over to the tavern, get some refreshment?
Sounds like a plan. I'm getting thirsty.
Alright, in the friendly confines of the tavern here.
I got my drink.
Much nicer than all those Nagas.
Indeed.
Today, what would you do if the statues around you came to life when you weren't looking?
Run and scream.
Yes, run and scream. That's okay. For those of you who are fans of Doctor Who, you'll recognize this as a reference to the Weeping Angels, one of the most famous entities that the Doctor encounters. The first time they were encountered, I forget the name of the episode.
I believe the episode is actually called Blink.
Blink, okay. I thought that it had something to do with blinking in the title.
and I will say that it is one of the few episodes of Doctor Who that do not actually center directly around the Doctor and is actually told from the perspective of somebody watching the Doctor travel through time versus actually traveling through time with him.
Yeah. Now, the closest thing that D&D has to a Weeping Angel is the gargoyle, which can be indistinguishable from a statue unless it moves. But unfortunately, I don't think you can, within D&D's turn-based combat system, have a combat encounter with something like a Weeping Angel. I don't know how you'd morph the gargoyle stat block into a Weeping Angel stat block to actually have a combat encounter with it. There's nothing that you can have in a combat-based system which would recreate the ability of a statue to not be able to move unless somebody blinks or was not looking at it. Mm-hmm. So I think this is coming at it more of a perspective from a different kind of hook, more so than a hook for a combat encounter. So how could we use this idea of statues that move around when you're not looking in our stories just to create interesting intrigue?
I imagine starting out is that initial terror.
Yes.
Of something that you thought couldn't move.
Uh-huh.
That cannot move. Stone does not move. And then it suddenly does.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's an excellent suspenseful mystery hook. Mm-hmm. Where the party just hears about this mysterious mansion or other place where they go, and all of a sudden they're in the midst of this phenomenon where every time they leave a room and go back in it, the statues have changed locations. Mm-hmm. Or every time they go back to this particular graveyard, the statues have moved. It just creates a real creepiness and a real level of intrigue to a particular encounter. And there's lots of different ways you could flavor it. You could have these creatures just be natural in your world. You could have these statues not be creatures at all, but be something that's enchanted, that just happens as a relic of something that has been there in the past, or even just a current enchantment where somebody has placed these things here in an effort to scare someone away from their hideout.
Well, and if you're doing a game with planar travel, these creatures could be denizens of an earth plane to connect to the other planes as a hook to why are these creatures crossing over into our plane, and how do we stop them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in that vein, I think it's an excellent opportunity to start an adventure, because you could have these characters in a spot where nothing is supposed to be going on, and all of a sudden this strange occurrence starts happening around them, and now it's a hook for, okay, why is this happening? And then it leads into a greater narrative that you have planned. So it's just an excellent starting point for an opportunity.
Sounds
too.
Very exciting.
Yeah, I love creepy things like that, which are great hooks into narratives. And I think these would be a great opportunity for that.
I feel like to add to that suspense of building using skill checks, were you able to maintain eye contact on the creature? It's almost puzzle solving also. Like, how do you keep the creatures from moving?
Yeah.
While still traversing the area that your party is in, because if you and it gives you an opportunity for different types of role playing, being like, okay, 3 of these are currently in your vision, and your 3 are in this one. How can you maneuver yourselves to look in those ways and making rolls to, did you succeed in not blinking? Yeah. Oh no, they're 3 steps closer to you now, and it's not combat, but you can still do turns. You can still install this sense of suspense, and as if you sell it to your table, the excitement of either escaping or being attacked, and you all got banished to the elemental plane of Earth, that then moves your adventure to somewhere else.
Yeah. I think that's an excellent way of framing that if you actually want to use it in a more turn-based way.
Indeed.
Well, I think that will just about wrap up this episode of Plot Hooks. Thanks for joining me today, Mike.
No problem. It was a lot of fun.
And thanks to all of you out there from all of us here at Plot Hooks. Me, Samuel, Mike, Matt, Steve, Dave, Zach, Becca, and of course, podcast pupper Ellie. We'll see you all again next week for another episode of Plot Hooks.